this work is actually one of my PhD students, Matt Lamb. He's to defend his PhD in the new year, but he couldn't make it here, so I'm going to share his work with you here today. And this work actually stems from some work with Craig a long time ago. So I'm going to show you two fast bowling ground reaction force traces here. The bowler on the left has about 4 times body weight going through the front leg, whereas the bowler on the right has about 8 times body weight going through the front leg. And if Craig asked Bard, whatever Bard is, but AI, who would get a stress fracture out of these two bowlers, all else being equal, and maybe you could do that, or if I asked you as a pub quiz question later, you'd probably all say the bowler on the right. And I might have the same thinking. But some years ago I was challenged about this. Well, tennis players get stress fractures in the lower back serving, but they're not on the ground, they're in the air when they get this injury. And there's no ground reaction force. So is this ground reaction force so important? And this was a question that we debated for some time, and in the end we got some funding to actually investigate it. And the point to make here is that you don't need the high force to bowl fast. So it's not that it's inevitable that having high ground reaction forces is required to be the very fastest. Now, these ground reaction forces cause accelerations to be transferred up through the body, but we're not solid systems. We've got lots of soft tissue in there, and we dissipate accelerations. And these compliances in wobbly masses that I can mathematically represent biomechanically, as well as joint rotations and soft tissue deformation. So, higher ground reaction force, more likely to be injured? Let's look at it. Now, I know from an ankle impingement perspective, we're probably going to all say that if we've got higher force, as we saw in the last talk, we're more likely to get injured. But if we think about lower back stress fractures, is that the case? We know we've got this repeated loading that we'll call microdamage, and a lot more of you are far more expert than me on that. And previously, we've thought there's this association. And as well as front foot contact, which is primarily where we'd looked at these forces in the past, because that's where we'd put a force plate, we could also think about back foot contact and follow through as well. So a nice simple study really, looking to quantify acceleration on the body, because we can't measure load in the body so easily, but we can put accelerometers on the body and measure them. Look at time and peak acceleration through the 3 phases, and try and understand what's going on within the body. And as a biomechanist, I'm always trying to understand. So we started off experimentally, putting IMUs on a bowler along with a full body marker set, looking at the kinematics and kinetics. And we had a range of bowlers of reasonable standard, a number of sensors put on the body as shown top left, and we asked them to bowl 1 over, or that's the data we analysed, and we did some statistics to see what was going on. Well, as well as using an experimental approach, we also looked at this theoretically, and we'd built computer models of fast bowling in the past, but never really applied them from an injury perspective. We'd only looked at performance. So we developed a similar model to previously, but put some extra information in the model to take into account compliance. So we've got a complex model, which I won't go into detail, but it allows us to model this activity from an injury perspective, from a load perspective. And we can use it, by doing this, we're able to understand and explore what's going on within the body. So as well as our experimental data, we've also got a theoretical model to underpin this analysis. Well, if we start off experimentally, so here's a typical trial showing the time histories of the acceleration on various points in the body, going from the shank through to C7. And it's relatively easy to see the shank, thigh, and hip accelerometer traces because you can see those peaks in turn. But L5, L7, and C7, L1 and C7, are all in the noise at the bottom. In other words, there isn't much acceleration from the ground getting there. And if we take that across the whole data set and plot it, and hopefully that's clear to everybody. So we've got on the horizontal axis here the different points on the body from distal shank through to C7. And then we've got the acceleration mean and standard deviation for across all the bowlers. And we can see some differences. So on that left-hand side for the distal shank, you can see for back foot contact, which is the small triangle, that the acceleration there is distinctly different to front foot contact or follow-through. But actually, front foot contact and follow-through are quite similar. And then the trends as we go from left to right are the numbers get smaller. But the magnitudes get smaller, but the trends stay the same. And if we look at it from a percentage perspective compared to the highest numbers, which are at the shank, then the percentages drop off through the thigh, hip, L5, L1, C7. So this acceleration, this force on the ground, is getting smaller the higher up the body we go. In other words, the body is really good at dissipating that acceleration. So when we get to L5, L7, over 80% of that acceleration isn't there that we can measure. If we think about it from a time to peak acceleration as well, then the time to peak is less than 20 milliseconds for the shank through to 80 or 100 milliseconds by the time we get to C7. What about from a theoretical perspective? And this isn't finished, this piece of work. Matt's still got a little bit of work to do on this. But essentially, here's a typical trial with the IMU values for the shank, thigh, and L5. And if we simulate that, we get very similar values to give us confidence that we know what's happening. And then just some simple perturbations. Let's make the body stiffer. So we'll increase the stiffness and damping parameters within the springs that are in this model. If we make them 10 times stiffer, it actually doesn't make too much difference. In other words, the body is still pretty good at dissipating things. But if we make them almost a solid object with joint angle changes, then it makes a big difference. So there is a component here that we still to understand fully, and that'll have to come out in the journal papers in due course. So, nice simple study. So to summarize, we've got lower acceleration at back foot contact compared to both front foot contact and followed through, but front foot contact and followed through are quite similar. So we've got similar peak accelerations there. And this time to peak, as we go through the phases, has the highest at front foot contact, but in essence it's more that it slows down as we go through the body. And more than 80% of this acceleration at the ground, or at the shank, doesn't get to the lower back, and so it may well not be such the issue that we think it once was. And these structures within the body are actually quite good at dissipating that acceleration. So to conclude, I guess I'm challenging what we've previously thought, but that's what you get as scientists in the link between high ground reaction force and risk of stress fracture. Don't think we've fully understood it yet, but we're getting there. And these structures within the body are actually quite good at dissipating the acceleration. And it doesn't appear that the majority of the ground reaction force gets anywhere near the lower back. Thank you.